Hello and welcome to the Quarantined Wargamer. I'm Big Lee, and today I want to talk about the use of player handouts when running a wargame. So last week my video discussed how to create narrative in a wargame. One of the ways that I suggested that you could do that was to use player handouts during the game, before and during the game. And I mentioned a few ideas, but I thought it was worth expanding on into a video of its own. So the areas that I'm going to discuss in this video, they're not exhaustive, they're just a list of suggestions. There's probably loads of other ways in which you could use player handouts, probably things that I haven't thought about, maybe things that you've used, so I'd like to hear about them in the comments, but we'll come back to that at the end. Most of the ideas that are in this video are things that I've actually done when running games of my own, or even indeed demos. And I've always had this idea that, you know, if it's good enough to use in a demo game, then why not using it in a real game? And of course, many of the ideas for use of player handouts and the other things that I mentioned last week, they come from years of running and writing role-playing games. And I really do think there's a lot of crossover that can be got from one area to another, so that, you know, those two separate groups of gamers actually got quite a lot in common when we actually think about it. And some of those skills as a writer of a role-playing game can really be used on the Wargames table. So definitely the things that we're going to discuss there are all things that I've used when running role-playing games and when running Wargames. They're probably one of the most common player handouts that a lot of wargamers probably already use to a greater or lesser extent is maps. You know, we might start a game by presenting the players with a map, either of the battlefield or the tactical situation, and it's something that I think could definitely be expanded upon, particularly if you can find historical maps when you're recreating an actual historical battle. Tactical level maps, stuff that give a lot of detail, but beyond just the confines of the battlefield. So, you know, things like, you know, use the internet, obviously refer to all your books. Museums often have some really good maps on display. Special collections, refer to all of those. And the larger the scale of the map, the better, I find, because it presents players with some realistic tactical information. How do you get your forces, dispersed as they might be, concentrate them on the field of battle? Do you get to control where that field of battle is? Wellington famously had the field of Waterloo mapped out long in advance of it actually happening, and you know, he expected to fight there. Presenting players with these larger scale maps presents the players with the need to filter the information they're being given. What's useful, what isn't? Can they make use of the information they've been given? And it also makes it very interesting for the umpire, because it can help them to set up a realistic looking table, obviously recreate the actual setting that a historical battle took place in, but it also enables you to set up, even if you're doing a fictional game, looking at a historical map can help you to create realistic looking terrain where the various terrain features actually work with each other. So it can present very real challenges for the umpire and for the players, rather than just purely fictional ones. Now, lots of games, particularly ones that I've taken part in, usually start with some sort of briefing by the umpire, telling you what the situation is, and maybe fleshing out the orders for each side. I like to take that just a little bit further, because there's a lot of room for creativity there. So presenting your players with some actual set of orders that they have at the beginning of the game. And they can be very specific orders, they can be overly vague. Sometimes those orders can be conflicting. You might want to give orders to different brigade commanders, for instance. Those orders can be of very good quality, very detailed and clear, and leaving room for the commanders to make on the fly decisions, or they can be very bad quality, very vague orders, or something that asks, like you say, contradictory targets for different brigade commanders, for instance. If you're going to do, 19th century and earlier, I'd say, try and do them as written orders, maybe typed up orders for early 20th century games, perhaps even using audio recordings to present orders to commanders for mid 20th century onwards. And of course those presenting players with a clear set of orders, or individual commanders if you've got multiple players on each side, presenting them with their own sets of orders, can raise some very interesting tactical questions for players. I mean, the most obvious one being, how much latitude do they have to follow those orders? Can they follow them, or can they choose to disobey them? It can replicate some very real circumstances if you're playing a historical game. I mean, as an extreme example, you're going to play the Charge of the Light Brigade, and you get Lord Raglan's orders. Do you go, jog on, I'm not doing that, or do you just follow the history and do what you was ordered to do? And then there's the use of captured intelligence in your game. Now that can be part of the briefing that you give players before a game starts, but it can also occur during the game. There's a lot of latitude there for creativity for the umpire running the game. It can take the form of lots of different types of information. It could be letters, it could be memos, it could be captured maps covered in annotations. That it can present a lot of information to the players, such as the dispositions of forces, force strengths, locations of units, and it can also indicate things like unit performance. Such and such an elite unit has actually been performing really poorly because they recently lost a commander, for instance. Or it can present information on casualty figures. That unit that you would imagine is quite formidable has actually been reduced in its capabilities because of casualties, or fatigue even. All of this can be indicated in these captured letters and memos that maybe commanders should have destroyed and have kept on their body. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you can print them in a style that's appropriate to the flavour of that particular period, so written information or typed up information. And with all of this intelligence, it leaves players with an interesting quandary. It begs the question, is it real or is it fake? So it adds a whole new level to the information that players are presented with, and can create all sorts of tactical questions and challenges for players, and I think it makes it much more interesting. And then to take that concept a little bit further, captured personal documents are sometimes really interesting. In the last video I mentioned, for instance, that you could give particular key characters on the battlefield traits and flaws, and that can be represented in the rules. A good example would be the Men Who Would Be Kings, where characters, particular leaders, have characteristics, and it can add a lot of colour to the game. But that can also be hinted at, as well as being represented in rules, it can also be hinted at in captured intelligence. So for instance, personal letters can reveal a lot about how commanders on the same side feel about each other. Are there rivalries, personality clashes, grievances that are reflected in, say, a private letter, or maybe again that those letters or journals or orders might indicate some sort of admiration, loyalty, or recognition of the abilities of a fellow commander, or indeed how they feel about the enemy. And these diaries and letters can include a lot of red herrings, which again presents lots of tactical information to the player that they then need to decide what's important, what isn't. And you can present this information to them during the course of the game. It doesn't have to be part of that initial player briefing. So that you could just schedule that you're going to give certain players certain information at certain points during the game, or you can make it actually part of the game. So if a particular leader falls in a melee, for instance, you could roll to see if some of his documents that are on him are captured. So that maybe presenting the opposing player with some useful information, or maybe not so useful information, at a key point in the battle. Again, it's all part of telling a story. It's taking it beyond just rules and playing a game like a game of chess and turning it into a story that you are participating in. So again, very much like a role-playing game in some respect. And then there's the use of photographs. Now, I've done this in a few games, and particularly for a demo game that I ran. So I printed out loads of historical photographs that show the setting, some of the key characters, Even aerial reconnaissance photos, particularly for 20th century games, can be really interesting and really useful. You're showing the exact information that the commanders at the time were presented with, and you can find all sorts of creative ways of using it. But you could also include things like photographs, portrait photographs of key characters, just to show them, so that the players get to see their historical character. They may not be as familiar with the setting as perhaps you are, so show them a historical photograph of the key commanders involved. It puts the game in its historical context. It gives it some perspective. As I said, I've done this in demo games, but why should that sort of level of detail be limited to just demo games? If you've got this information and you've done your research properly, you've probably got all this information to hand. Share it with your players when you're going to run a game. It makes for a much more interesting experience, and it helps tell that story of the battle that you're about to play. So as I mentioned before, I'm a lifelong role player, and I appreciate, as a result of running games, I appreciate that art of showmanship when trying to tell a story. And I really do think that the same can be used to enhance a war game. Whether that's using maps or written orders, captured documents or period photographs, they all tell a story beyond merely the technical aspects of a battle or a rule set. So the quick question is do you use any of these methods? Do you have other things that you've used? Do you have any other suggestions for the use of player handouts during the game to enhance the storytelling aspect of the game, to push the activity and the action along? So I'd love to hear from you as always, and please leave your stories in the comments below or over on my blog, Big Lee's Miniature Adventures. So as always, I'd just like to say I hope you enjoyed that video, and I hope you found it interesting and useful. Maybe it's given you a few ideas that you hadn't thought about. And as I say, I do really strongly feel that there's a lot of overlap between role players and wargamers that perhaps isn't being explored as much as it perhaps should be. And as someone with a foot in both camps, I do like to take some of my experience of one and put it in the other, and vice versa. So as always, if you did enjoy the video, please hit the like button. Consider subscribing to my channel, and of course leave your comments below or over on my blog, Big Lee's Miniature Adventures. So until next week, as always, stay safe, get as many games as you can, and of course keep rolling high.